Good evening, everybody. My name is Shannon Hart, and I am a second year here at The Ohio State University studying public affairs and city regional planning. And my co-host.
Hi, I'm Lisette Arnold. I'm a fourth year student at the Ohio State's Public Affairs College. And thank you guys all for being here.
So we would like to welcome you to the second night of our webinar series, African Americans in Public Affairs. This is our second night, which is the present, which features public affairs professionals. And we would like to start off tonight's program by acknowledging that the land that The Ohio State University occupies is the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandotte, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. Specifically, the university resides on land ceded in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville and the forced removal of tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. We want to honor the resiliency of these tribal nations and recognize the historical contexts that have and continue to affect the indigenous peoples on this land.
Today's event is a moderated panel featuring professionals in the public working in various public sectors. First, we have Kier Scott. He's a 2020 graduate of the John Glenn MPA program. He's the current policy and performance manager at the Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio.
Our second panelist for tonight is Vedette Gavin. She is an experienced public health strategist, researcher, and leadership coach working for the advancement and flourishing of Black people and communities.
And next we have Ms. Morgan Harper. She's a community activist, a lawyer, and former candidate for Ohio's 3rd Congressional District.
And our fourth panelist for tonight is Shannon Hart. He is the current Columbus City Council president and is committed to building an equitable future that works for every resident in our city.
Okay, so again, thank you all for participating on this panel with us today. We just wanted to talk with you and just get an inside look into your careers, and hopefully you can inspire other public affairs students what they can do in the future. So first, I want to ask you all to give me a 1-minute description of your educational background and your day-to-day tasks and your area of expertise. So we can just do this in the order of how we introduce you guys. So Kier, you can go ahead and start.
Yeah, so thank you so much. My name is Kier Scott. I'm with the Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio. What was my education and career path? So I started my education at a small private school in Tiffin, Ohio, where I studied government and national security with the intent of working in the national security apparatus, public policy and politics. And after graduation, I went on to grad school at the Ohio State University, John Glenn College of Public Affairs, in pursuit of an MPA. And during grad school, I got an internship with my current employer, the Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio. And then they brought me on full time after I graduated in May of 2020. And regarding what my day-to-day is like, it sort of depends on the day. But I would say that I spend most of my day analyzing data and working on understanding the performance of our workforce programs. I mostly monitor our Title I Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, Adult and Dislocated Worker, and AMP, which is a youth employment program. I also monitor, write, and research local WIOA policy. And the rest of my day is sort of spent working on other workforce stuff with the rest of my team in order to make our agency one of the leading workforce agencies in the state. So, thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Vedette Gavin, and thank you so much, Lisette and Shayana, for having us. So my educational background, I think most importantly, I'm a proud graduate of Eastmore High School from Columbus Public Schools right here on the east side of Columbus. Shout out to all my Columbus people. I was a pre-med major, a med school dropout, a graduate who was a young millennial with not many job prospects. It was like work at the Marzetti salad dressing factory or work in a blood transfusion center. What do you do with, a pre-med degree that went nowhere, right? And so then it led to opportunities working in community around health, because health of children is something that I love. And then led to several years of work at the local health department, and the recognition that I actually had no idea what they did there. And so I should probably go study that. And I became a student at the College of Public Health at Ohio State, at the Ohio State University, where I fell in love with public health. And I figured out that that was like a holding container for everything that I love, for community, for justice, for equity, for systems, for policy, for all of those things. I also then went on to get into the MPA space, studying at the Harper Kennedy School of Government, and really thinking about how we knit together the way that urban centers are planned and developed, and what that means for health, and in particular health equity. So my kind of area and focus of all of this is around health equity, looking at population health and understanding how the policy and programmatic decisions that we make affect the health of disinvested, marginalized, oppressed people and communities in our cities, and making sure that our plans for economic and urban development actually lift up the health of those populations. And so from the day to day, I run a health equity consulting firm based here in Columbus called Verge Impact Partners. And I also run a longitudinal study at MIT about gentrification in health. So that's a little about me.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Morgan Harper. I wear a few different hats, but how I got to the place of doing all these different things starts on the east side of Columbus as well. And just getting exposed to what I felt like was a fundamental disconnect between what we're sold as the American dream and what the reality is for many of us living in this country, and certainly here in Central Ohio for quite some time. And that led me to college, being really involved in community service more than anything, but through majoring in Spanish, I double majored in Spanish and community health. So it's interesting that a few of us have a health connection. I learned there was this thing called public policy, and that's what's controlling these outcomes. And I've got to figure out how to understand that and get in charge of it. So from there, and I worked in Washington, which I'll talk a little bit about after college. And everybody who seemed to be deep on this public policy thing was a lawyer. And I was like, all right, I got to be one of those too. And I ended up going back to school. I got a master's in public policy and did a joint degree, and also got a JD and became a lawyer. And have done a few things after that. But currently, where that's taken me and how I would describe myself professionally beyond being a former candidate is really an organizer. I run a local organization here in Columbus called Columbus Stand Up that focuses on grassroots organizing, recognizing that we need the political will for the policy outcomes to get accomplished, but then also organizing the policymakers. And during the day, I work for an organization called American Economic Liberties Project that's based in DC and is an advocacy organizations around issues of corporate consolidation, concentration, which in my view drives a lot of the inequality we see, and why I actually moved away from focusing exclusively on health to more of economic issues, feeling like if we all just made a little bit more money and had a little more control over our lives, then we would start to see a lot of other areas improve as well. So I'm happy to be here and really excited for the conversation.
Well, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's an honor to be with this panel. To Shayana and to Lisette, thank you so much. To Elaine, but then to the awesome panelists, Morgan, Kier, and Vedette, it's really an honor. My name is Shannon Hart, and I was born and raised here in the city of Columbus, on the south side. So I'm not an east, well, I live on the east side now, but I wasn't raised initially on the east side. I went to Columbus City Schools. I went to Columbus Afrocentric School for most elementary and middle school, and then graduated from Columbus Alternative High School. I went away to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, and studied political science and international affairs. And I came back to Columbus after graduation and got started in the mayor's office. And that's like an untraditional pathway to go from like college straight into the mayor's office. And really it was proximity. My mom, when I was born, was a front desk clerk at city council. So it's like all full circle. And really what that did for me was it brought me out of Southfield and said, hey, those folks downtown are not that much smarter than you or I or anybody else, and that if they can do it, I can do it too. And so in high school, I started interning in what was then called the Mayor's Action Center. It was precursor to the 311 call center. And that's where I got my like real love for public policy and public service, really, because it boiled down to people being in need, reaching out to somebody downtown who was supposed to help. And usually there being this crazy disconnect and really mistrust or distrust in the system and in the institution of government. And my favorite part still to this day is being able to chip that away, to break down by being responsive, being open, being transparent about what we do right and what we do wrong and what I don't know. Hope to trying to build back that trust and that faith in good government and that connection to one another. So I worked in the mayor's office for 6 years before applying for an open council seat when I was 26. I got the seat on the first try and ran again in 2015 to hold the seat, in 2017 for a full term. And then in 2018, my colleagues elected me council president. And at the time, I guess still, I was the youngest council president in our city's history, and I'm the first openly gay council president. I just say that and because for so many folks, they see these titles and don't think that there's a connection to regular folks. There is nothing in my DNA that said that these things were supposed to happen. It came down to mentors and to doors being open for me to get here. And so I'm just holding the space till we have our second gay council president or the next youngest council member. So I'm honored to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you all so much. And it was enlightening to hear everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of Columbus natives. Me and Shay are also from Columbus. We're Columbus City School kids as well. So it's nice to have conversations with people like you. So a lot of you already touched on this, but we had another question about how you were able to break into your career field. So again, we just heard Shannon talk about his mom breaking into city, but can we just talk about how we got into our field?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm the only one that's not from Columbus. I was born and raised in Marion, Ohio, small town, an hour up north. So, but in terms of my career path, while I was in my undergrad, I was also doing an internship in the Ohio House of Representatives. And I had a lengthy discussion with my boss, I remember, about civic engagement in the nonprofit sector. And I also took a lot of calls from constituents here in Columbus. So although I was not born and raised in Columbus, I took lots of different calls with constituents in Columbus. And some of those calls were very tough. And I realized that there were a lot of people in need of access to programs and services here in Columbus. And I was also helping on some gubernatorial races, which sort of reinforced my desire to work in politics and public policy in the nonprofit sector. Then as a result of some of those experiences, I wanted to continue my education at Ohio State. And I wanted to really focus my desire to work in public policy and administration around the nonprofit sector and really focus my education around poverty and equity and actually housing policy. I ended up getting an internship with the Workforce Development Board in 2009, 2019, sorry. And then I realized that I actually loved workforce and economic development. And throughout my research on complex issues of race, poverty, and housing in the nonprofit sector at Ohio State, I realized that I kind of had this epiphany that poverty and inequity were much more systematic, and it was much more than just getting and increasing people's access to housing, which was what I was interested in at the time, and still am. But I was sort of naive or didn't have a full grasp or understanding at the time. But it's much more obvious to me now, and it's more about increasing people's access to various things that perpetuate poverty and inequality, housing only being a piece of the puzzle, right? So cue my desire to continue my work in workforce development and economic development. My current boss and CEO of WDBCO, Lisa Pat McDaniel, she offered me a full-time position right out of grad school in May of 2020, and I excitedly accepted. So that's kind of how I got here.
I think I'll just echo a bunch of things that I've already heard in my colleagues' stories. You know, there's a thread about Morgan lifted up about how could she be of service, right? And I think one way that I ended up getting into the space that I was in was like thinking about what I was really passionate about and what I loved. And I mean that from like a gut sense for me. Like I wasn't very exposed to like careers. It was like pastor, nurse, policeman, fireman, doctor, right? Like that's what it is, teacher. And so really just thinking about like, what do I love? Like I really loved science. I really thought like health was vital. It was important to me. I did a quick internship in high school at Children's Hospital, and I was like, well, sick kids is not where it's at, because that's sad. And I just was like, oh Lord, help these babies. They're so sick, you know? So like going with what I love. And I think another piece that Shannon mentioned is like family, like reaching out to, and I think Kier, you mentioned this in your narrative too, like we are all connected to somebody. And that those somebodies can help expose you to a little bit more than you knew before. And for me, it was my pastor, and she had this ministry at our church called the Rock on the Block Health Ministry. And I was like, well, what is that? You know, and I went to a coalition meeting with her. And that's when I found out what a coalition was. There's that. And, you know, where's this meeting? It's at the health department. Well, what do they do there besides give you your birth certificate? So I think I just slowly reached out to and paid attention to the people who were around me. And I think the other important thing for me in particular was what I call like my fairy godmothers. Like I always had this network of older women, Black, white, Asian, Samoan, it didn't matter, who would kind of say, you know, why don't you think about this? Or come serve on this board with me, right? T Street put me on my first board, and I said, what's a board? And she said, they govern a nonprofit. Well, what's a nonprofit? I didn't know. I was 16 years old, right? And she said, sit at this table and read these minutes. What's a minute? You know, it just was all the things. And so I say that to echo Shannon. There was nothing special or really like high achieving about my like IQ or anything else that was present in my life, but it was just being curious. And because I focused on something I loved, it was just, I wanted to learn more about it. Where are you serving? What is the farmer's market? People need food, and just following the path of interest. And then I'll say, you know, what really allowed my career to flourish, I guess, at such a young age was really, I think, kind of like an economic concept of like, you know, buy low, go to the areas where there's not a lot of competition. And for me, that meant while everybody was trying to move to Charlotte and move to DC and come down to Columbus, I went to Cleveland, where they were begging for organizers, where, you know, I would go to young adult events and it's everybody under 45. And I was 24 going, why are you here? Now I think that's young now that I'm closer to 40. But when I was 24, I was like, why are all the young people 40 in Cleveland, right? Because they didn't have a lot of young energy there. So like go places where people want to teach you. You know, that's one thing that, you know, I did, and go places where your service is needed. And those will be places where you can learn, you can experiment, you can create, right? Because there's nothing there. It's an open canvas, and you can really, really kind of give what's in you and learn actively every day while you're building. So I think those are things that really helped me.
Well, I should have followed Vedette's advice. I didn't do that. So I went right to the belly of the beast in Washington, D.C., where everybody's clawing against each other and with very few connections, and had never worked there before. But I would say there were two really pivotal networks that I was able to tap into that got me in the doors, the right doors for public policy. One, I was grateful to be part of a scholarship program called the Ron Brown Scholar Program that unfortunately applied to during high school. So that's not, you know, all that relevant, but I do want to honor that program and the role it had in just pushing me to challenge myself. And so my first job after college, my priorities were, I've got to get a lease. I have to be able to pay that lease. And I need to have a job, or I would like to have a job that's somewhat connected to public policy that will pay me enough to pay for that lease, right? And the job that I got was working at the Federal Trade Commission, an agency I'd never heard of, loosely connected to this idea I had about like economics of things being important. And they were hiring for paralegals at a rate that would have allowed me to live in Washington, D.C. at that time in 2005. And so with that, I went to it. I hated it. I cannot tell you how much I hated that job. The best part of my day was the $1 I would spend on a tea from Starbucks, because that was all that I could afford within walking distance from the building. And I was going to accept that reality. It was a 2-year commitment. You know, we're all raised to do what we commit to do. And I was going to do that for 2 years, because I said I would do that for 2 years. And I talked to the director of the Ron Brown Scholar Program one day. I remember it very clearly. I was going on my walk for my $1 tea from Starbucks. And I was like, I don't like this, but I said I would do it for 2 years. And so I just wanted to start talking to you now about what I'll do once the 2 years are up. And he was like, Morgan, you are crazy. You need to get out of there, right? You're way too talented to be wasting time doing a job you don't like. Give me a day. And he got back to me. And in a day, he was like, there's a woman, she's fantastic. Her name is Melody Barnes, young, Black, just got hired to be the senior vice president of policy at this new think tank called Center for American Progress. And she's looking for an assistant. I was like, an assistant? That doesn't sound very good, but I don't care. I need to get out of the Federal Trade Commission, right? So whatever. And so I interviewed with her, and the rest is history. I got that job. I quit the job at FTC. I took a pay cut, but I could just tell, it was like, this was the energy that I wanted to be a part of, because it was an energy that was about power and advocating and fighting for what we thought was right and learning the political system to get it done. And so that, you know, without that nudge to get over myself and any like fear or obligation that I felt, that was more about an institution than mission. And then also someone who was willing to hire me and became a mentor for the rest of my life, Melody Barnes. I don't think that I would have been able to have the opportunities that flowed after that.
Well, to kind of wrap things up and pull like from everybody's narrative, I guess it would be like 2 things that got me on this pathway. One being something I talked about, that first internship in high school where I was in the Mayor's Action Center. And when I tell you it was like granular and like mundane work, it was literally somebody would call and be like, hey, the Department of Public Service, they wouldn't know the name of it, but the recycle the folks, the trash folks they skipped my house, and I'm really pissed about it. And you could tell by their conversation that they really didn't want anything to change, or they didn't expect anything to change, but they were just registering their concern. And so back then the job was to click over, call the refuse department and be like, hey, would you send somebody back out to so-and-so, you know, on Livingston Avenue and get them? And they're like, yeah, tell them we'll be there in 4 hours. And to be able to click back over and tell this person that their city is going to work for them, and we're going to send your the trash pickup to them in some small way, but in like a really large way, change the relationship with their local government. I got addicted to that. I still love that part of public service, the constituent service part of it, that there are folks that need help. And I know even now as council president, I don't have all the answers, but I promise that if you give me an issue, I will work my hardest to connect with somebody who can give us a solution or put us in the same in that direction. So that's when I fell in love with public service and specifically local government. So fast forward, I went to college, came back throughout the summers and worked either in a department in city government or on a campaign. So in 2007, I helped to run the Issue 1 campaign, which was a tax increase on our wages here in Columbus. It was during the middle of the Great Recession. Most cities were laying off police officers and firefighters and folks, and we raised our income tax by 0.5%. We were able to grow our city, and it helped out. That got me a little bit of the political experience, and got continued to encourage me to go down this path. Fast forward a little bit further. I think about Morgan's story about going to DC after college. I so desperately wanted to go to DC after college. But I came out in 2009, and like we were really in the middle of the Great Recession, and like I went wherever I could get a job. And so that was back home. The mayor knew me through that work that we just talked about. And so he offered me a job in the mayor's office. Great experience, but for real, my friends, I would see them like on Facebook, living the DC lifestyle of a public policy person, they look hungry because they were poor working, but they were had that experience. But then, what really got me to run for office or do the elected side is after 5 years working for Coleman, I was his liaison to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which meant that I traveled a lot with him. I had one-on-one time. And the big point of this part of the story is just mentorship. Having somebody to see something in you that you may not see in yourself. I remember being on this flight back from a conference with the mayor, and he's like, I think it's time for you to step up to public service. And I'm like, well, what do you mean, mayor? Like, I'm in your office. And he's like, I think you should run for office. And I'm like, mayor, I'm too young. I'm too liberal for this city. I'm too young. He's like, what are you talking about, bro? And I'm like, well, I'm young. And he's like, I don't get it. I'm like, well, mayor, I'm young and I'm black. He's like, bro, what are you talking about? I know that you're black. I'm like, I'm young, I'm black, and I'm gay. And he was like, that's only a problem if you see there's a problem. Actually, that's why you must do it, because the city is becoming younger, more progressive, and more diverse, and they have to see themselves in their elected official. That was the nudge that I needed to go into public service. I am so much more better suited to be behind the scenes, to be behind the policy person. But I think folks saw that I could do this other side of it. And so that was my push and step out and kind of be a more the forward facing part of public service. And that's how I kind of got my start.
Well, thank you all for sharing that. I would like to say that all that's very inspiring. And I think that applies to anybody of any background who's, trying to get into this field of like public service. You don't know how it's going to happen, but, knowing certain people and, getting certain experiences will help you there. But I think that it's important to also note that all the people on our panel today are Black. So this next question is specifically about that. And what are some challenges or specific experiences that you've experienced as like a Black professional in public service or public affairs?
Yeah, so I'm new into my career. I mean, I just talked about at the top of this, I graduated in May. So I can't say that I've had many challenges as a Black professional. What I will say though, is one of the most significant challenges that I do deal with is imposter syndrome. Although I am, I'm not unique in this, I might just say that, Black professionals may be uniquely situated. And what I mean by that is that we sort of hear, anecdotally, but Black people often have to work harder, be smarter, work longer hours to be taken seriously, to be respected or promoted, or even to feel like you deserve to be where you are. I'm sure most Black people have heard, or people of color have heard that the saying that in order to succeed, you have to be twice as good, twice as smart. And I believe that this attitude, can manifest into things like imposter syndrome. And in my opinion, this is a result of discrimination, whether implicitly or explicitly. Stereotypes about Black people and how we work, et cetera. Although my employer may not have ever made me feel this way, and actually my employer does value what I do and gives me space for nuanced conversation about race and equity for Black people. I believe it's sort of an inherited feeling because of how we as a general society treat people of color. So I often have to remind myself that I'm exactly where I am because I'm smart. I'm great at what I do. I've worked hard and I deserve the opportunities that I've had. Of course, there is sort of an underlying conversation here that I'm sort of ignoring regarding the idea of, meritocracy, and, that I would be remiss if I didn't at least acknowledge that, I've had access to certain privileges that have allowed me to go to school, to go to grad school, and to access certain opportunities. But maybe I'll leave it there. I hope that all makes sense.
They all make sense, and I'd say ditto to all of those. Like I've been there and often am there a lot. I think something I can add on to that, there's, there's been so many, but I think a few in particular, right? There are kind of the structural and systemic like inequities around like qualification and value, the way you are valued. So, I've definitely had the experience of, oh, train this, white person who literally hasn't even graduated yet. We'll pay you 7 extra cents, train them for a year and let them become your supervisor and let them make $10 an hour more than you. I've definitely had the conversations of, if you want to be taken seriously in this career, you should literally physically look different. To where your hair should be straight. You shouldn't wear such vibrant colors, all the things, right? Even body shape, right? Because for a while I was doing healthy lifestyle stuff in public health, right? So all of those things. But I think particularly in the research space, I'll talk about two challenges, that I face in the public sector research space. One is, racial inequity normalizes a way of thinking that values white dominant culture and those patterns of thinking, right? And so I think it contributes, Kier, like you were saying, to that imposter syndrome, but it's recognizing that your thoughts and perspectives seem fringe, but that is by design, right? So you always seem to be the off one. Well, why are you talking about, we're trying to solve a regional housing shortage and you're talking about this one neighborhood and this one group of low-income people, right? And so it's like when you come from the margin and focus on the margin, then you inherently seem fringe. But what you really are is insightful, and you are outside of the bounds of that system's understanding, right? And so it's like the constant work to retool and reaffirm the fact that, like, you not only are excellent, but your thoughts are necessary, and the pressure not to conform and then say, well, what I need to do is view this issue through the way that they've taught me to view it, through this framework that never acknowledged any of the things that I've lived, right? So to hold your lived experience as vital to the way that you do your work, I think for me, it's like the constant, like, this is why you need to take your vitamins. This is why you need to know who your people are. This is why you need to read what you read, like to do all those things. And then I think the second thing is just, again, like a conflict of values and identity. There are things in research that we value that I don't actually value in real life. And it's not kind of the way that I was raised, and it's culturally irrelevant, like meritocracy or individual contribution or genius or American exceptionalism, like these things that come through in the institution of the academy to say you are valid and you are a good thinker if you did this all by yourself. When in reality, as an organizer and a person who believes in community, like nothing comes by yourself, right? And so I think it's like just really holding tight to who you are and who you want to be and how you want to contribute, and being okay with that and understanding that that is deeply tethered to your racial identity and that that is an asset and not a liability. So.
Yeah, I so agree with that. And that's actually a theme I was going to touch on in terms of knowing what your vision is for your career and sticking to it and being as confident as possible in pursuing that. But it is difficult because of all the reasons that Kier noted. Like, it's not just an accident. These environments were not made for us to be in charge necessarily. And the culture is not encouraging our leadership all the time. I think, a lot of that has maybe changed over the last couple of years, or at least is moving in a better direction. But I will say, especially in my experience in some DC policy circles, you get tracked. We talk a lot about like getting tracked in school and, the gifted program or not. The tracking can also happen in a professional level. And the tracking often in DC would be who's going to be a policy person, who's going to be an advocacy person, who's going to be a communications person. And before you know it, you could look up, you could be mid-career and you're like, oh, I don't get to be a policy person anymore. Like, I'm not what? I don't get to be at the table when we're talking about what exactly the legislation is going to be or what this regulation is going to look like. I'm just supposed to talk to other people about it. Okay. And here's my point. Maybe you want to do that. And that is fantastic. That's a skill set that is really important to getting anything done. But if you actually think that you want to be a policy person, then you need to be hyper aware that you're not getting tracked unintentionally. And so I find that it is no accident that most of the people who find themselves getting labeled as like a really smart policy person tend to be white guys. A lot of them, especially in DC, tend to go to the same schools, and they all reward each other for being great at doing that, or perceived to be great at doing that, right? And so, that's been one of the biggest challenges, I think, is pushing back on that and continuing to have the confidence and build the confidence over the course of my career to assert myself to where I want to be, which is designing exactly what we're going to be doing, right? And you know, to also have a strategy with this, I mean, I think one tool or tactic that I've developed over time, and I would say, you know, especially when I was working at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an agency that was created after the last financial crisis, new agency, startup, great people, excellent people for sure. But most of the people that were policy people were white, and most of them were white guys, and also in the research department. And so it was like, you know what? There's an old boys network. Let's create our own network, and let's organize the Black community of the CFPB. And so that you have people that are in different meetings, that are aware of what decisions that are getting made, of who's getting invited to certain things. And you start to have your own advocacy internally to make sure that you all can look out for each other. That's something that, you know, I think we should all take into different professional environments that we're in. If it doesn't already exist, create it, and have our community support one another and make sure that we're all getting tracked exactly where we want to be, in our making sure our perspectives are really reflected in the policy development process. Because I think that's too why we don't see a lot of the outcomes that we want, because we aren't at the table making the most important decisions.
Wow, it's like so hard to follow like Morgan and Vedette and having these conversations, because literally both of them hit on like the two things that I was going to talk about. Morgan called it being tracked. I call it being trapped. And so I started my career as community outreach. I realized several years into my career that that is exactly where folks wanted me to be and stay in that area. So I was not at the policy table for many years. I was the person that would have to go out and build the relationships with the Black faith community or LGBTQ community, these different communities, and be the face of these policies that affect people of color, people look like me in my neighborhood down Southfield. But I was not at all a part of those conversations. And so, you know, I try to be very intentional now with my team to make sure that my folks that do outreach, community engagement, community affairs know that is a time period. I mean, again, as Morgan said, if you love that, if that's what you want to be, then do that and own it and be an expert in it. But I want to make sure that we're not unintentionally putting those barriers on folks just because they may have the relationships. And I think that's why at least that was certain excuses given to why I would be good just in community affairs and not in policy. But something that Vedette said, talking about, you know, and Morgan brought this up too, like the culture itself does not suit us if you are not brought up in these environments. Like working in the mayor's office as a young Black man, like folks talking about golf and stuff, like I didn't play golf, like, and I didn't have those experiences. I didn't, want to, and you realize that so much of what was happening was not happening 9 to 5, like in our traditional engagement, but they were going out drinking at the pubs together, and it was just this cultural thing. And so it was always either pushing my way in and be like, I'm gonna be here with y'all. I'm gonna be uncomfortable. Y'all not gonna laugh at my jokes. I'm not gonna laugh at y'all's jokes, but I'm gonna be here. Or to Murray's point, making your own environment, creating your own space with other folks of color, and creating those avenues. And what I learned that my experience alone in a meeting, coming from Southfield or coming from, is enough. Like if I'm in the room, then I'm supposed to be in the room. And if what I'm adding to the meeting is just that other question, like, well, have you thought about this? It might seem very routine or mundane to me, but it seems novel to the folks in the room because it's the perspective that they don't have, not growing up like we do. And so that's something that I just had to learn and get really comfortable with. Like if I'm in the room as the only Black person, then I'm supposed to be there, which means I'm supposed to say something that maybe takes the conversation in a little bit of a different direction, but that's okay. Like it's not that I'm wrong, or that what I'm saying is not a value. It's just different because of my perspective, and just getting comfortable with that, and then weaponizing that or owning that is really where I started to understand my power and influence.
I think all the things you shared are going to be very valuable, I think, for me and Lisette and everybody else who are moving forward into the field later. Things to look out for sure. This next question is for President Hardin. If we can keep all of our answers for this next section of questions, because they'll be directed to each of you a little, I guess, quicker, just because we want the audience to be able to present some questions as well. This question is, what do you believe are the top 3 most pressing issues the city of Columbus is facing, and what is city council doing to address them?
Certainly. So I think we have, I see my time in leadership around the word growth. Over the next 20, 25 years, our city is going to add 500,000 to 1 million more people. The question is, what kind of city will that be? It can't just be bigger, it has to be better as well. Will it be more equitable? Are we breaking down the barriers to make sure that my 6-year-old nephew who's going to grow up a chocolate boy in this city is seen as an asset and not a liability, somebody that all of our hopes and dreams are built on and not someone to fear. So that is the work of equity and making sure that community safety is seen not as a policing exercise, but as an investment in communities. Second is transportation. We are the largest city in the country that does not have an advanced transit system. We cannot, literally, we cannot add that many people, 500,000 to 1 million people, and with the current system that we have. It will change our quality of life here in Columbus in a adverse way. And then the last thing that's very connected to transportation and transit is housing. All of these things are connected. When you add 1 million people to this city, we're going to have issues with density. And how do you bring people together and create walkable communities that are safe and vibrant? And so I view like most of my important work around growth, knowing that, I don't believe that Columbus is great because of the 5 years or 6 years that I've been, or 7 years now, I'm almost 7 years on council, that I've been on council. I think that we kind of have a pretty dope city because people 20 years ago started thinking about stuff. And so if that is true, then it's the work of us right now, the folks on this panel, to really be working to develop the community of 2050 when we have 1 million more people. That's such dope work. It's so empowering. It's scary because it takes a long time to turn this ship and to make sure. But I really do believe that growth is our biggest opportunity and our biggest challenge, and that's the work of today.
Thank you for that. Our next question will be directed to Kier. So obviously you work in workforce development, so I'm going to ask you something that pertains to workforce. So access within workforce increases, So access within workforce impacts opportunity. How does your work address systemic inequities?
It's such a great question that unfortunately I won't be able to answer or to break down or at least fully in 2 minutes, right? But what I've discovered even before I got into my role is that poverty and inequity are sort of wicked problems, right? And what I mean by that is, and you may learn this at the John Glenn School, but poverty, for example, is linked with education, workforce development with poverty, the economy with nutrition, and so on. So these problems are typically, sort of offloaded to policymakers, or are written off as being too cumbersome to handle in mass. And in my office, we sort of dive headfirst into that. So our key focus is really getting people to their next best, right? But the problem is we can't do that if we don't simultaneously tackle the most significant barriers to employment, specifically employment that pays sustainable wages. So for example, people can't access jobs that pay them fair and equitable wages if they don't have access to transportation or childcare. So as a result, you may see that Black and Brown people may have to get a job that is more just, it's more a matter of convenience, or it's conveniently placed in their neighborhood. Additionally, this along with other systematic barriers to employment result in Black and Brown people being overrepresented in lower paying jobs. So, how do we address these systematic inequities? I guess one of the biggest ways that we do this is through our training programs, which do have the ability to really get at some of those barriers, and we use supportive services to address those. So if a parent comes into our job center and they want to participate in an IT training program, for example, which will give them a credential that will provide them with more opportunities, but they don't have childcare or transportation, we will assist in providing those resources. And another thing we do and are actively working on is centering the voices of impact populations. And that's really, really important. We know from job seekers and a bunch of literature there are requests for greater access to training and apprenticeship programs that equip people with, marketable skills in high need areas, right? Which may lead to careers with stronger wages. So what we've done is we've begun to take our services to people in neighborhoods and through targeted zip codes in which there are these high amounts of concentrated poverty and, high amounts of concentrated poverty, specifically in Black and Brown communities, through things like partnerships with the Columbus Metropolitan Library, for example. So essentially, we know that access is a major barrier. So we take the services to people versus only allowing people to come to us. So it's kind of a roundabout answer, but there's a few different ways that we try to get at some of that.
Thank you. I know that was probably a hard question, but when you said wicked problems, that brought me right into intro to public affairs. And I already know how frustrating these wicked problems can be, and typically those are the problems that we want to tackle head on. And so our next question will be for Ms. Morgan. So can you elaborate on your work in regulatory law and the anti-monopoly work that you do? I know we didn't really touch on that much in our previous questions, but if you could just introduce what that is and your day-to-day.
Yeah, for sure. So, there's this whole movement that is actually a historic tradition. I know there was like a history component of this question too, where we have had a set of tools called antitrust policy for the most part, but there are also other tools that can address corporate consolidation. Like when large corporations get too much power and they're also controlling what we would think of as like critical infrastructure, like railroads or telephone lines, and they start to wield that power in ways that aren't beneficial to the general economy, then the government steps up and does something about it. The government hasn't been doing that for the past 40 years because this is like, could go deep conversation, but because of something called the Consumer Welfare Standard, essentially prioritizing price above all else. And so just quick example of how that plays out. Take, for example, like the big tech, social media and internet giants. They don't charge us technically for any of those services, right? Like Facebook, if anyone's still on Facebook, I wish I didn't have to be, but if you're organizing, at the local level, you have to be on Facebook. But Facebook, you don't have to pay a fee, but they are getting a lot of our data, right? And they're using that data to just like continue to entrench more and more of their power and prevent other people from entering the market. And so this anti-monopoly movement that's really like getting back to a tradition of a suite of policy tools that folks used in the early 1900s, even up until the 1970s, we're trying to get them to be used against big tech and also pretty much every market of our economy right now that is super concentrated. And what that looks like is both regulatory agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, which ironically, where I hated working, is now one of our targets of an agency that has the power to do something about this. I didn't realize that I hated working there because I was right in the middle of this abandonment of antitrust tools. And so the agency hasn't really been doing anything. So it wasn't just me, but then also Congress can pass bills that address these issues and take on monopoly power. And ultimately the president, and we've already heard some early signs from President Biden that it's a priority for him to also take on corporate consolidation, both among big tech companies and some of the other markets in our economy, like broadband, for example, another super concentrated market, which is why they can just like make up, we're going to charge you $150 this month and you can't do anything about it because there's no competition. So that's a quick and dirty, but the main point that I wanted to make with any policy area that you're pursuing is the need to just read up on it. I didn't know anything about anti-monopoly policy before working at this organization, starting to work for them over the summer. But you can just read and get up to speed and then start to plug in. I think, Kier, what you were touching on this too, right? It's like a lot of these issues are interconnected. Some people are going to be an absolute expert in a certain policy area. I've always been more of a generalist myself. And just through reading and getting an understanding of the history and also the political dynamics, you can start to plug in and make a difference quite quickly.
So this last question is for Vedette. So could you elaborate a little bit more on your public health work in terms of prioritizing civic participation and measuring the success of policy?
Sure. I think, all my colleagues here like hit home like that all of these wicked challenges are connected. And I even think like the 3 challenges that Council President Hardin raised, right, around transportation and housing and inclusive and equitable development and growth for a city When you think about these things, like especially at the population level, we usually use data that shows us what's happening to people on average at a given increment of time. And we use the rate of change that we've seen in the past to compare how we're doing. So we look at the things that we've always measured and the ways that they've always changed. And then we say at present, this is either better or worse, right? And one challenge with that, when you think about something like transportation, you know, Council President Hardin also said, like, okay, those things are intricately connected to high density development, right? Because you need to be able to live near transit if you're going to walk to it. And so we might say, look, you know, the average person's commute time is cut by this, and, you know, congestion is changed by that. And there are more jobs, you know, per capita for this. But what does that mean for the people who are on the margin? You know, so you're learning your stats, there's a bell curve. And so we look at the change for the average person over time, but that doesn't tell us whether that change is because those benefits are being distributed to everyone. We don't know if that changes because people who were already in the middle are just doing better. And we don't know if that changes because people who were actually on the tail end now have access to something they didn't have before. And so they're bringing that average up. And so like in my work, you see things like, oh, there's the move for, you know, smart growth, high density development, walkable communities. And we show things like, oh, you know, we redeveloped this neighborhood and it's more walkable. And on average, the average income for a household is higher. But we all know from the people who live there that the income is higher because none of the poor people live there no more, right? But the data, if you just look at it and say, we're evaluating this because the average family income has increased by this percentage over this many years without giving respect to, well, for who, right? So I think in policy work, it's really important to ask the two questions like, what is better? Who decided that was better? And for who? And that's where you cannot divorce policy work from community engagement on the measurement side, because many of the things that we call better, we've never measured because we haven't thought about success for those people. We don't think about success as how many of Shannon's nephews are now viewed as an asset. If we measured how many young people growing up in Columbus who are viewed as a threat are now viewed as an asset 20 years later, that is a form of success that we don't measure. When we think about, you know, I did a big study with the Federal Reserve credit score data, and we looked at who was moving where, because folks in Boston were like, oh, anecdotally, people are being displaced. But when you look at the Federal Reserve data, like there's no difference in churn from poor neighborhoods to wealthy neighborhoods. Well, one is a move of choice and the other is not. And the human impact of those moves are completely different. So you can't just call something better because it's the same for everyone. So here's where like understanding the lived experience, and Morgan talked about this with expertise. The people who are usually designing these studies have not lived through any of the things that we're talking about when it comes to equity. Therefore, the nuance or the possibility of the nuance, they're blind to it. They wouldn't even think that the outcome might be different for a Shannon's nephew than it would be for, you know, Sarah's nephew, right? Because they don't have that knowledge, that expertise to say that life is different for these groups. And so that, like, I live by the mantra, like, do nothing about me without me, that we hear in the organizing space, but in the evaluation space, you can't just arbitrarily choose a measure because people chose it before and then say, this is proof that a thing is better. Better according to whom and for whom. So.
Thank you for that. And the last question we're going to ask is from the audience. Anybody can answer this. It says, several of you work in the healthcare sector / policy. Can you speak about the lack of trust within the Black community in the healthcare industry? I think that's very important to speak about.
Yes. I mean, this is, I think we can all have something to say about this. I mean, I think it's multi-layered. It's knowing true history and what kind of clinical medicine and the academy have been used to do to harm, oppress, and dehumanize people and literally facilitate genocide for some populations. There is, the history of Tuskegee and other racially predatory experiments in the medical sector here, particularly against formerly enslaved Black persons, Asian people of Asian descent, Native nations, right? Like we've used medicine and the things that we've claimed to understand about the differences between different humans based on their ethnic and genetic phenotypes, right? We've used that to oppress and dehumanize people, and people for whose grandparents and great grandparents lived through that. That is a factual reality that you cannot undo just because now we have shows like Grey's Anatomy that were written by a Black person about medicine. Like those generational experiences of harm are not undone just because of technological advances or a culture that embraces medicine. And then I think, there's this other kind of culture of compliance that has been really harmful, where we've said health looks like this, and we've decided what that looks like for people. And then we rate them and provide them access to resources based on how well they comply with us. And I think that's also kind of in the management of chronic diseases, kind of when you think about healthy lifestyles, obesity, servings, food, what is healthy, what is not. Even things like, mandates for self-care and managing your own stress, they assume that people come from the same kind of cultural and positional reality, but they don't. And so there's this kind of culture of surveillance and compliance that when you add that onto the historical harms that have been done to those communities, there's just so much there. And again, that's why representation and engagement actually matter, so that we have a system that understands well-being holistically from the perspective of the people that they are treating. And I think you even see in the data around infant mortality, around chronic conditions, that when a healthcare system culturally and in terms of its culture and in terms of its staffing actually reflects the culture and beliefs of the community that it's serving, the rates are much better. So I'll say that from my perspective.
I'll just quickly jump in. There's not much I can add to what Vedette just said. But even like on top of like the historical, not just inequities, but trauma that was produced on to people of color over the years of the medical community, it would be crazy if we didn't have skepticism about healthcare and about what this means for our bodies. But even on top of that, I think about how we digest information and who we trust and how we make decisions. It's just different culturally. Like we listen to our trusted folks like our grandma and our family who had those different experiences. And so for me in my current role right now, as we try to have this conversation about the safety and efficacy of vaccines, it's not like nobody in my community in Southfield is taking this shot because I said so necessarily. They're taking it because their grandmother went and took it and said, this is my experience, or their pastor, or someone that is much closer. And so it's about communication. It's about giving the space for us to be skeptical and like ask the question, like, why can't we ask the question about what does this mean for my body? And then have the ability to make that decision for ourselves. And so for me, it's all about communication and getting that information out through avenues and ways that folks can digest it. And I think that's by trusted folks weighing in.
I just add one thing to all of that, because it's been interesting, especially Shannon, I'm glad you mentioned the vaccine. The messaging around is like the media coming to understand that, we would be skeptical, but then weaponizing that by creating a narrative that our community is the reason why more people aren't getting vaccinated. And it's like, hold up. Like, hopefully if you take away one thing from this session, it is to be skeptical. That is your job as a public policy professional, right? To ask questions, to demand data, and get to the facts to inform good public policy. And in this case, once people started digging in, it's like, oh, actually, no, sorry. It's a lot of like white Republican men who aren't getting it. That's what's really driving the low vaccination rates. It's like, wait, what? People just say anything. And so, really like the professional discipline of stop. Why, what are you saying? Exactly how Vedette was describing it, like good research, like, what do you think is the truth? Why do you think that? For who? All of that, just like being very clinical in your analysis of issues, I think is just going to make you so powerful as a leader, as a as a public policy professional. And then just to one thing, because I saw the question about current programs, PPIA, if people haven't heard about that, that's a really great program that you can do as a summer program that then opens up financial aid opportunities for getting a master's in public policy. So just want to make sure people are aware of that opportunity as well, to just get training in that policy analysis to supplement what you're already doing in undergrad.
Thank you so much. And I'm just so glad that question was asked about healthcare and the distrust within the Black community. So we wanted to end our last session on a question about healthcare as it pertains to the pandemic with Professor Hassan Jeffries, and but we weren't able to because of time problems. But I'm so happy that you guys did wonderful. Thank you so much. I learned a lot in our planning meeting when we were just talking about doing this. So it's no surprise that I learned a lot. Thank you to every single one of you for coming out. You guys are amazing. And then I just want to make sure that everyone knows about our next event, which will be on next Monday, and we'll be talking with students like me and Shay, and that are in public affairs, and they want to be like you when they in a few years to come. So we're just going to talk about what we plan to do in the future and things like that. So hopefully you guys can come out, and then to our attendees, hopefully you can make it to the next one as well. So thank you again so much. I'll be sending you guys a thank you email.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys.
Thank you
Great
so
job.
much.
Great job.